All right, we're going to go ahead and get started for today. Welcome to our Missouri Open Door workshop. Today's topic is going to be Assistive Technology Basics. I am Angelina Alpert. I am a research assistant at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Institute for Human Development. For today's agenda, we have an overview of the No Wrong Door initiative, as well as some announcements. And then for our learning objectives today, we're going to talk about the importance and history of assistive technology, understanding what assistive technology is and isn't, and some considerations for selecting assistive technology. Okay, so Missouri No Wrong Door is a framework that is meant to transform the way that people access services within their community. The goal is to support individuals and caregivers to make decisions on complete and accurate information about their options for anyone seeking long-term services and supports regardless of age, income, or disability. Some announcements for some things we've got coming up. Missouri Assistive Technology has their Power Up conference this year. It's going to be April 3rd and 4th. I will drop a link for registration once I am done here. Charting the Life course has our 7th annual showcase this year. We're going to be fully in person. It's May 2nd through 4th in Kansas City. I will also send registration information for that. That's a really great way to meet people that use Charting the Life course and hear about the ways that they're implementing it in their work. Missouri Family to Family also has some Good Life groups. These happen monthly. They're peer learning collaboratives that allow for people to get together and learn about Charting the Life course, and also just how other self-advocates and family members navigate their lives. They are for a couple different age groups. Blast Off is going to be ages 13 and under. Launch is going to be ages 14 to 26. Planning Forward is going to be adults 27 and up. And then there's also a sibling-centered Good Life group, which is for anyone that is supporting a sibling. Next, we have some information about Missouri Claim. They can answer any questions about Medicare, finding out whether or not you're eligible. Their link is there, as well as their Facebook page. They post a lot of great information there. And then we're going to get into it for today. David's going to start us off with setting the stage for technology.
All right. Thank you very much, Angelina, and good afternoon, everybody. Glad to have so many of you joining us here on this. I'm assuming it's raining in other parts of Missouri as well. And for those who are not familiar with me, I'm David Baker. I'm Director of Missouri Assistive Technology. And we, Missouri Assistive Technology, along with the Institute for Human Development, have been offering these Missouri Open Door workshops now for a couple of years. So we want to continue on our theme of what we've been sharing with folks over this last couple of years. And we just kind of want to look a little more broadly at assistive technology in this particular segment. So we're going to kind of take a step back from the devices and some of the other themes that we've had in this series and do a little bit more of a global approach in this session. So we want to refresh our memories about assistive technology and why it's important, who uses it, some common myths that are out there about assistive technology, some current issues in the field, and then like I said earlier, just kind of broaden our conversation in general about this whole subject of assistive technology. So if we move on to the next slide here, And we'll go through these super quickly. Okay, so one of the things that I think sometimes we may forget or may lose sight of when we're talking about assistive technology is what's the purpose? Why are we doing this? What are the outcomes? We get a little caught up on things like the devices, or maybe we get caught up on funding or some of those other ancillary issues that are out there. But we always have to keep in mind that the reason we want to be focusing on assistive technology is because of what it is about. So it's about participation. If we move to the next slide, it's about offering people with disabilities opportunities for education, to go to participate fully in the K-12 environment, to go on to post-secondary, to get higher degrees. So it's about participation, it's about education. In the next slide, it's also about employment. We have a lot of great things going on in the state of Missouri around folks with disabilities and employment. Assistive technology is critical to that. It's also critical to community living, which is the next slide here, where we're just, making sure that people are able to live full and productive lives as members of the community, and assistive technology plays a key role in that. And then also, finally, on the next slide, the whole reason that we want to be thinking about assistive technology, learning about it, applying it, is because towards the end of our lives, it's also about our ability to age in place and to live in our homes as long as we possibly can. And assistive technology is very critical to that as well. So, just kind of the opening here is about the why. Why is it that we want to be focusing in on assistive technology? And we don't want to get bogged down in all these other things. We want to remember what the end goal of all this discussion is at all times. So who uses assistive technology? If we move on to the next slide. I've tried for a number of years to get a really pinpointed number of assistive technology users in the United States, and it just doesn't exist really. And I think actually in some ways that's a good thing. But we do know that approximately 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. That could be anything from having difficulty speaking, to being able to type, to write, to memory issues, on and on and on. Seeing, hearing, mobility, and many other things cause disabilities that create barriers for individuals, and those are all potential users of assistive technology. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little about the history of assistive technology. And I'm not going to go in depth on all this, but I just want to kind of give this picture here. So assistive technology, the modern era of assistive technology, as people often say, it happened in 1876 when we saw the development of the first portable hearing aid. And then over the years, we saw some other forms of technology that came into being, such as the sip and puff wheelchair, the Kurzweil reading machine, which would convert print text into an alternative or into an auditory format. The first augmentative communication devices came out in 1983. And I could nerd out on this forever because I'm a history major by training. However, the key thing is that throughout this history of assistive technology, it's been around for a lot of years, over 100 years, almost 150 years. And we still sort of have this attitude that assistive technology is an add-on. It's not a built-in, it's an add-on. We think about it after the fact, and we've done other activities and provided other services to folks with disabilities. But we need to change our thinking so that our history doesn't kind of look like this anymore, that we just kind of have rolled assistive technology into everything that we do. There are also, on the next slide, some myths that continue to sort of plague us in this arena of assistive technology. That there are 4 or 5, I guess, primary myths that we continue to hear that we need to kind of get out of our thinking and sort of get out of the system as we expand the number of people that are thinking about and getting access to assistive technology. The first one is that all assistive technology is complicated and high tech. Sometimes I refer to this as the CNN syndrome. It seems like anytime that you see a news report about anything that has to do with technology and people with disabilities, it's something that's right out of the lab and super expensive and super cool. But that's not the reality. The vast majority of devices that are available to people to help them address barriers are going to be low-tech devices that are relatively inexpensive. Yes, there are some things that are complicated, and yes, there are some devices that are high tech, but that's the sort of the exception to the rule in the experience of most individuals who use assistive technology. The second myth that is out there that, again, we need to push out of our thinking is the idea that assistive technology is expensive. It is not. The Job Accommodation Network has had a great sort of fact on their website for a number of years. They work with employers who are incorporating assistive technology, and I believe that their data shows that the like 80% of all job accommodations are under $100 or something of that nature. So again, just like most devices aren't complicated or high tech, most devices are inexpensive, not expensive. Sometimes we hear people talking about the need for somebody to have certain skills before they can use assistive technology. They have to show literacy, or they have to be able to do this, or they have to be able to do that. That is just putting us all behind, to be honest, because whenever we talk about assistive technology and putting it into somebody's life, we need to make sure that we're meeting them where they are at. They don't have to have a skill set. The example a lot of times I'll use here is that you didn't have to have prerequisites before you went out and bought your first cell phone. So why do we do the same thing to people with disabilities and say that there are certain prerequisites that they need to have before they can qualify or access or use assistive technology? Meet them where they are at with the skills that they have on that particular day. And then finally, the last myth that we kind of hear bouncing around out there is that, I have this individual and they use device A, and device A worked great for them, and I have this other individual, so we'll just use device A for them as well. Assistive technology needs to be decided upon on a case-by-case basis. Everybody is different. Everybody has different skills and deficits, and so we always need to make sure that we are thinking about the individual that we are working with at that point in time when we talk about assistive technology, and not just carbon copy everything as being appropriate for everybody just because they have a disability. I'm a big fan of a woman by the name of Sarah Hendren, and she has a book called How We Meet the World, or How the Body Meets the World. I can't remember right now. And it kind of talks about assistive technology and design, and it's just kind of a funky, cool book. And she has a line in there that all technology is assistive technology. And I think that that is a very true statement at this point in the 21st century. So if we move to the next slide, we will see, I believe, in a minute, we'll come back to Sarah's statement there that all technology is assistive technology. Okay, so there are some current problems in the world of assistive technology that we see kind of bouncing around out there. And I may see these a little more clearly than some of you, just because I spend so much time thinking through some of these larger issues in this field. But for too long, the field of assistive technology has relied on the idea of the expert model. And the expert model is the idea that we, agency A, agency B, organization A, organization B, we don't need to know about assistive technology. We'll just go out and find somebody who can do an evaluation and tell us what we need to get for an individual. The expert model is, there are great people out there that are doing this type of thing, but we need to get away from the idea of buying our knowledge in assistive technology and relying on others to tell us what to get, because we will never have enough experts out there to address all the need. A lot of times, assistive technology is also driven by legislation or policy, not by individuals. And the example I use a lot to illustrate this is if I am employed and working with VR, for instance, then I may have access to funding for assistive technology for certain devices because I am in the employment sphere. If I'm a student in a school district, then the legislation, IDEA, says that I have to have assistive technology considered for me as part of my education. So it gets really chopped up out there because we're guided more by the legislation and policy than we are of the actual needs of the individuals, and helping across the lifespan can, helping them address the various barriers, because that same barrier that a kid that's 12 has, they're going to have when they're 24 and 36, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need to think again, less about legislation and policy that drives this whole conversation and more about how we can maximize the potential of the individuals. We also kind of yank the rug out from under individuals a lot when we talk about assistive technology, and that's tied to the legislation and policy. One of my greatest frustrations is that we see these students that graduate from high schools in Missouri that have had all sorts of great assistive technology. It belongs to the school. They graduate and they have to start the whole process again, all over, trying to find those devices. And so we don't have this seamless system where devices are following individuals throughout their lifespan, or there's equal opportunity for them to obtain devices depending on where they are in the lifespan. So, and then the language that folks like me are guilty of using versus the language that individuals use in this whole discussion about assistive technology. I mean, in our office, for instance, we can nerd out all day and we can talk about direct select and scanning and eye gaze and blah, 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 all these terms that we see used a lot in the AT world. But when somebody calls us or somebody emails us or somebody has a conversation with us, they're using a completely different type of language. They're usually saying things like, I have this situation, or I've encountered this barrier, or because of my issues with my fingers, I can't do this. And so again, we kind of need to get a little off the lingo and a little bit more on just understanding exactly what it is that people are struggling with. And then how we define assistive technology, and I'll kind of talk a little more about that on another slide. So essentially what I'm saying here is that we need to broaden the conversation because we live in a golden age of technology. It is absolutely astounding to me the array of technology that's out there, and even more astounding to me is the array of technology that's out there that can benefit people with disabilities. And it's only going to increase, and it's only going to get better as time goes on. There are whole areas within the disability community that 5 years ago we didn't really have options for, but now we do. And it's only, again, going to expand as time goes on. So we need to broaden the conversation to realize we have this great opportunity right now. It's a golden age, and that assistive technology and the related services around it are integral to the lifespan. We have to think about them in terms of all stages of a person's life. And then finally, in order to meet the needs that are so prevalent out there, we need to focus on increasing knowledge and skills for everybody. We need to bake the idea of assistive technology into a lot of areas and build capacity throughout the entire system and in the world of everybody who is going to touch on this subject. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so this is how I talk about assistive technology. There's actually this federal definition out there, and it's super vague, and it's a lot of words. But I break assistive technology down to this. It is really an umbrella term. And under that umbrella are two pieces. The first one is devices, the other one is services. And those devices are usually what we get most focused on, finding a device that's going to be a solution for an individual. And it's important, no doubt about it, but hand in hand with this are all the related services. So for instance, how are we going to fund it? Does the individual need training? Who else in the individual's world needs training? Can we borrow it ahead of time? You know, lots of all those questions sort of fall under the second part of the definition, which are the services. It is critically important that whenever we talk about this umbrella term of assistive technology, that we are equally focusing on how we're going to provide the services to the individual as we are how we're going to provide the device. So the next slide is also another basic building block here, which are the levels of technology. So this goes back to the idea of the myths. We don't have to jump to the most expensive high-tech device that's out there, because that might just make everything far more complicated and somebody may be more inclined to discontinue use of the device. So we preach the idea that you start at the left-hand side of this graph. Sometimes there are just simple modifications or ways that we can just kind of change a person's environment. We don't even need to use any technology. We just haven't thought about that. And an example that has been brought to my attention on several occasions is I can go out and I can find some really cool stuff to prevent fall prevention. But sometimes all we have to do to prevent fall prevention is to move a rug or improve the lighting. And that's not really necessarily assistive technology. That's just an accommodation. And so if we don't have those options, we start looking at the low and the light tech devices, which are the less expensive, less sophisticated, easier to learn devices that are out there that a lot of times can be really effective for somebody. And there are tons of things that I can do more independently myself in my own home that fall under this category of light or low tech, but their impact is amazing, but they're not sophisticated or complex. And then there are medium tech, which might cost a little more, might require some training. And then we have the high tech devices. So whenever we explore assistive technology, we want to start on that left-hand side there with accommodations and kind of walk through what our options are and see if we can't find something that's at the lower end of the technology scale before we just jump to the idea of only a high tech device is going to help somebody out. On the next slide, this is what, and this kind of goes back to what's the quote from Sarah Hendren about all technology is assistive technology. This is just a random collection of devices that are out there. I just went to Google Images and went bing, 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 and dropped them on this slide because this is where we are at. When I began working in this arena of assistive technology, the vast majority of devices that we utilized were dedicated devices. They were designed for one purpose, to help somebody address a barrier. And we see an example of that in the upper right-hand corner with the electronic enlarger that has the crossword puzzle underneath it. That was designed for one purpose, to blow up print text so it can be accessible to somebody who has low vision. Over the years, we've seen mainstream technologies like the iPad build in accessibility features. And so all of a sudden, a mainstream piece of technology becomes assistive technology, even though we just consider it to be technology. And then we have these interesting little situations like right below the iPad are several examples of some voice assistants, where devices that were originally designed for the general market are seen completely differently by people who have disabilities because they realize, gee, I can use my voice, I can turn lights on and off, I can raise and lower my thermostat, et cetera, et cetera. So the bottom line on all this is that assistive technology is all around us, and it's really in the eye of the beholder as to what piece of technology is going to help me address a particular barrier to enable me to be able to do something that I want to do. All right, so next slide. And I guess we can just kind of, we'll kind of shift gears here a little bit and talk a little about the whole idea, some additional building blocks that are around the idea of how do we get started and what are these skills that we all need to kind of have in our toolbox so that we can effectively work with individuals on this issue of assistive technology. So if we go to the next slide, these are what are kind of the 4 phases of assistive technology, if you will. I'm a big fan, for some bizarre reason, of productivity books. I don't know why. Been that way my entire life. If you actually followed me on a daily basis, you'd see I probably haven't absorbed much out of them. And some of you who are a little bit older might remember the old 7 Habits of Highly Effective People book that came out by Stephen Covey. But he does have a line in there that I think is really applicable in the world of assistive technology, which is begin with the end in mind. You know, early on, we looked at why it is that we should be talking about assistive technology, those opportunities it opens for people. And so whenever we sort of begin thinking about devices that might be effective for somebody, we need to start with the end in mind. Why are we going down this road? What do we want this piece of technology to do for somebody to improve their life? So the first phase of the whole discussion about assistive technology is consideration. That idea of why do we want to do this? Who's the individual we're working with? Who do we need to have a discussion with? And consideration is kind of interesting. It shouldn't be it should just be an ongoing conversation. So for instance, you're sitting down at an IFSP meeting. Are you talking about this individual and assistive technology? They may be, for instance, employed in a job, and so that's an opportunity to have a discussion about whether assistive technology might be effective for them. Are they doing fine on the job? Are they encountering some barriers? Why are they encountering those barriers? Should we consider some assistive technology? I was on a telephone call. What are those telephones? I was on a webinar earlier this week, and there was a person from the Georgia Department of Education, and they have started a program down there when their teams in their schools sit down to do IEPs. That's called Take a Minute. And the whole idea behind Take a Minute is to take a minute to talk about assistive technology in that IEP meeting for that student that they are all sitting there discussing. So that'd be really cool if we had the same thing going on every time we had a discussion about an individual at whatever stage of the game they're at. But if we get together with a group and sort of talk through this idea of just consideration, a brief discussion about whether or not technology needs to be incorporated into that individual's lives. We also, the next stage is to determine the needs. And we can have a whole big discussion about this. There are some great sort of frameworks and scaffoldings out there. But what's the common denominator on a lot of these is the idea that before we can have a discussion about a device, we need to have a discussion about the person. What are their strengths and weaknesses? What do they want to do? Where are they doing it? What are some things that are in their environment? Get that holistic picture. And then the last thing we really want to have the discussion about is the device, and trying to figure out what type of device might be effective for them. And I think a little later on, we're going to talk about this idea of feature matching and how this fits into this whole discussion. And then after that, if we can do device trials, and again, Missouri has the ETC program, which we operate, which, it always makes sense. You wouldn't go out and buy a car without test driving it. Kind of the same thing with assistive technology. It's important to do a device trial to see whether or not what you thought was going to work is actually going to be effective for that person, and they're going to be motivated to use it. And then finally, we need to make sure that we have a discussion about implementation when we have a device. Who's going to support the individual? What types of things do we need to make sure that we're aware of? And how do we need to collect data to see if it's effective? And so we start with consideration, we determine the needs, the features, we ideally do a device trial, and then once we've identified the device, we need to pay attention to implementation. So if we move on to the next slide, that's you, Angelina.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat really quickly, which is going to be the link to our website in the spot that has all of these tools that you'll see up on the slide here. The three of them on the right, the integrated star, the life domain vision tool, and the life trajectory, are all ones that I'm going to get to later. So the one on your far left, the LifeCourse portfolio, I just wanted to touch on that one really quickly before we move into the other ones. But the portfolio is a nice way to have all of your planning tools in one place. The front page has information about the person on it. So it's questions like what people like and admire about me, what's important to me, and how to best support me. Then once you go into the portfolio, you'll have a trajectory, and then on the back is a star. So our main planning tools will be all in that portfolio. That way everything is in one place. And we're going to move into these tools and the LifeCourse framework as we're talking about the considerations. We really want to use the Charting the LifeCourse framework and these tools to help understand the individual's vision and needs, and then we will move into how and why assistive technology can help after finding those visions and needs. So this here is your trajectory for exploring. So this is really to get your vision for a good life. On your right, you'll fill in what you want as well as what you don't want. Seems a little silly at first to think about what you don't want because it seems kind of counterintuitive, but it really does help you think about other things that you want when you think about it from the other way around. On the top of the line, where it says Sarah's vision and trajectory, that space there is meant for you to put things that will help you achieve your vision. And then the bottom of the line is going to be where you're going to put things that keep you from achieving your vision. And so as you saw on the previous slide, the trajectory that I showed you looked a little different. This one here is our planning trajectory. And that one is the same concept as exploring, but it allows for more concrete steps and experiences in both your past and your future that have helped you or will help you, or have deterred you or will deter you from achieving your goal. So I'm going to come back to this. In that the main idea with these trajectories is that you're seeing the person's vision as a part of the considerations process. Now moving into the life domains. So the life domains are just to think about different parts of life. They are all interrelated and they're all connected. And they are daily life and employment, which involves things such as school and education or employment, volunteering or routines, as well as life skills, community living, which is housing, living options, adaptations and modifications that are needed for the home, community access and transportation. Social and spirituality is friends, relationships, leisure activities, personal networks, and faith community. And we move into healthy living, which is medical, behavioral, nutrition, wellness, and affordable care. Safety and security is emergencies, well-being, legal rights and issues, guardianship options and alternatives, and advocacy and engagement is valued roles, making choices for yourself, setting goals, responsibility, leadership, and peer support. So when it comes to the life domains, the service system tends to only want to focus on healthy living and safety and security. But in order to have a holistic approach to your good life, it really is important to consider all of these things. So this is our life domain vision tool that we saw on that first slide. And so the goal of this is to form a vision and plan for the future in each life domain. So as you'll see, it gives the description of the life domains that I just mentioned. And then in that third column, you'll fill in your vision for that domain. And then on the far right, you'll see it says priority. So it gives you a space to prioritize the domains. So whatever you feel you need to focus on first will be the top priority and go from there. Next is our integrated support star. So when it comes to services, a lot of the times those services kind of cut people off from the rest of their community and the rest of their relationships. And so it's really important to focus on integrating those supports. That way, if one thing fails, you are not completely cut off from any supports and services that you have. So we've talked about the STAR before, but just to briefly go over it, there are 5 sections of the STAR. We have personal strengths and assets. So this is going to be any personal abilities, any personal knowledge or life experiences, strengths that a person has, any like personal belongings or resources that an individual has. When we move into relationships, there's 3 different types of relationships. So that's going to be any family members, friends, or acquaintances that the individual knows that can help. Eligibility specific are need-based services. They're also eligibility based. A lot of the times that's either whether there's a disability or a diagnosis, eligibility requirement or if it's based on income level. Your community-based supports are things like businesses, parks, schools, any of your faith-based communities would be there. Also any groups or membership organizations and any local services or public resources. And the community-based resources are all ones that anyone would have access to. There is no eligibility for community-based services. Then we move into the technology part of the STAR. And that would be any type of technology, whether it's personal use, assistive or adaptive technology, or environmental technology. So we have a worksheet, which I will send out in the chat, which is the integrated supports sheet. So it breaks down all of the domains. And then it has all 5 parts of the STAR on it. So right now I just pulled out the technology one since that's our focus. But it just gives you a bunch of different technology ideas by domain. So really helpful if you are trying to see what your options would be, or maybe if you're kind of not sure what you need help with, this would be a good place to see ideas for that. So now we are going to move into determining needs and feature matching. So I'm going to pass it back over to David.
All righty. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I'll confess we did some editing at the 11th hour and I wasn't quite sure if there really was a next slide or not there. So okay, so just a quick review. Okay, so we have all these options that are ahead of us, and we're trying to figure out where to go. And we've already looked at this slide before, but just as a quick reminder, ideally we want to start at the low end of the technology scale and work our way up as we begin to kind of sift through all the devices that are potentially available to help somebody in a particular situation. So on the next slide is the idea of feature matching. And so this is really important in terms of helping us be able to identify a device that is going to be appropriate for somebody. And again, it helps us kind of peel back the onion so that we kind of can go out and look for devices that meet these particular features that we've identified as being appropriate for the individual or being necessary for the individual. So another way to describe this is it just helps you stay focused. And you don't have to necessarily know the names of the devices, but as you're out there doing research, you're looking for these particular features. And so when we review options for an individual, there are 4 things that we need to keep in mind. 4 sort of feature matching elements that we need to keep in mind. The first one is that the input. How is the individual going to interact with the device? And so something we see a lot with iPads is that, well, we all know that they're direct select. I reach out, I touch the screen, and the screen does what I want it to do. Not everybody can do direct select. So we need to make sure that whatever device we're using has the ability to have the individual independently be able to activate that device. The next area of feature matching is the processing features. And so that basically is a really fancy term for how does that, if it's a software program, if it's an app, if it's a device, how does it work? How is, for instance, a language system laid out on an augmentative communication device? If I need help because I'm a struggling writer, what features are there in that software that are going to help improve my writing? So, how do we access the device? What's going on in that device? And does it do what I need it to do? And sometimes the processing can also be the idea of just simplifying. You have somebody they're using, let's use an iPad again as an example, and they have lots of apps on it, and you're wanting them to use a particular app to maybe submit their timesheet. But they get cluttered in all these other apps that are out there. And so sometimes it's just as easy as simplifying the screen on a device as part of the processing and one of the features we need to make sure that the technology has. The fourth or the third piece of feature matching is the idea of output. what are the what's going to happen when I activate that device? How's it going to communicate to me? If I am, is it going to speak what I want to? If I'm somebody who has speech issues, is it going to take print text and convert it into an auditory format? If I'm somebody who's a struggling reader, so how do I get information in? How do I interact with it? What happens when I'm interacting with it, and what's coming out the other end? And then finally, and this is just sort of the peculiarity of human beings, but there are other human factors that we need to take into consideration when we are trying to identify a device that's appropriate for the individual. So to give you an example, there are lots of great tools out there that might help somebody in an employment arena. But let's say we began by thinking that we were just going to put them on an iPad. We realized that that's not going to work for them. It needs to be something they can put in their pocket. Or sometimes it comes down to just the color of a device. But these other human factors are important to make sure that we kind of suss them out, because they can be get in the way if the device becomes too cumbersome, if it's too heavy for somebody to move around, and maybe even in some instances if it's the wrong color. So we start off with the idea of, okay, we know that this person needs to use assistive technology. There are lots of devices that are out there. What do we need to find in those devices that we might want to try with that individual? How are they going to get information into the device? What's going to happen when they're using the device? How's that information going to be relayed to them? And then finally, are there any kind of special considerations due to the environment or the individual's peculiarities that we need to take in mind as we are out there trying devices or trying to find a device to use with an individual? So if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so then we ideally want to try to do a device trial. And that's, again, where our ETC program could come into line and give you the opportunity to do a device trial. One of the reasons that we wanted, well, the primary reason we want to do a device trial is we want to know that we have identified the most appropriate device for an individual, and that they have had some success with it, and that they are motivated to use it. I'm usually the first person to say that, sometimes in this world of assistive technology, what we think is going to be the spot on answer, we are way wrong on, and we didn't know till we used the device. And so there are lots of instances where we discover stuff as we're doing a device trial. Maybe the device is a little too heavy, or maybe it's a little too complicated, or maybe we were using it in an employment situation and we realized that there were some issues inside that environment that made that device not ideal, because that device is supposed to help somebody on the job, not hinder them. Let's Angela, move on to the next slide. I can't remember what's after this one. Okay. All right. So just a little bit more about the device trials before we talk about capacity building. It's important whenever you do a device trial to kind of lay out some responsibilities. Who needs to be part of that device trial? Do we just give the device to an individual and see whether or not they flourish on it? Or do we need to spend some time before we have them use it, teaching them how to use it? Are there other people in the individual's environment that also need to be part of this device trial? So they need to have some familiarity with how to use the device. And then we also need to be collecting some data as we go along. The reason we might have gotten a device for an individual is because there is a functional area related to their job or to school that is the primary reason we got that device. So is it addressing that problem? Are they able to address that barrier and do something? And are we collecting the data to prove it? The other not only do you collect the data to make sure you have the right device, you can also collect that data to help make your case to funders. That's the right device, and gee, we really need to get this thing funded because this is going to open up opportunities for an individual. So this whole idea of capacity building there's lots of great stuff out there. And it seems that my observation over the years has been that some of the best resources are ones that are written more towards the K-12 environment, but they are equally applicable if you are working in the community living arena or if you're working in the employment environment. And so you could go through any of these that are listed here and just insert easily employment, community living, whenever they talk about schools. But a number of years ago, probably at least 20 years ago, and these have sort of continued to be the gold standard, there was a group out of Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Assistive Technology Initiative. And they came up with a whole series of tools and best practices around the issue of consideration, of feature matching, of going from the low end to the high end of the technology scale. And they're a little bit outdated, but the whole idea is still super solid, and it makes a great framework that you could easily adapt in any other environment. There are some sort of frameworks that have been out there for a number of years. There's the SET framework, and there's also another one called the HAT, which human, I can't remember what HAT stands for, but SET stands for Student Environment Task and Tools. And earlier, you may remember that I touched on the idea that the last thing that we really want to be paying attention to, ironically, when we talk about assistive technology, are the tools. And so SET is designed to help us kind of guide through the process of who are we working with, what's the environment that they are in, a job, independent living, whatever, what are the tasks that they're trying to accomplish, and then we pay attention to the tools. And HAT does something similar, but this framework is just absolutely critical in this discussion of knowing who, where, what, and then discovering the assistive technology. For those organizations that want to spend more time with you just kind of in baking assistive technology or technology in general into your services, you might get familiar with the quality indicators for assistive technology. Again, it's adaptable to other arenas. These were developed for school districts, but it's a set of self-guided rubrics that can help you identify where you are today with how you're doing things in certain subsets of the world of assistive technology, and how you can then kind of move up where you ultimately want to go. Your end, keeping the end in mind, you want to be really good at doing assistive technology, and these tools can kind of help you see where you're at currently, what the next step is, and what you need to do to get to that highest level that you want to achieve. And then finally, any of the assistive technology states or assistive technology programs have great resources on their website. And that last reference was to AT3, which is our Federal Technical Assistance Center. And you can find any Assistive Technology Act program there. Obviously, we have a lot of stuff on our website at Missouri Assistive Technology, but I'll confess some of our colleagues do much better with resources. I am a big fan of Oklahoma's. They have these nice little short videos that they put out, like a new device a day, which are kind of fun and can kind of keep you in the loop as to what all is out there in the way of devices and new devices that are coming out. So WADI, the SET, the quality indicators and assistive technology, and then any of the Assistive Technology Act programs are wonderful resources to spend some time with on a regular basis, just to get more familiar with how to do implementation, how to think about assistive technology, how to build your capacity, and how to stay on top of the types of devices that are coming out onto the market. So implementation. This is where the rubber meets the road. And so when we get a device, we want to do a device trial, or maybe we've purchased a device for an individual because we have gotten to the point where we have identified what's the most appropriate for them. And so again, you just don't want to give a device to somebody. You have to have a plan for implementation. You have to have some idea as to what it is that how you're going to do this, and who needs to be involved in this whole process. Otherwise, you may just end up with a device that's just kind of sitting there abandoned. And so implementation is basically the idea of what supports or maintenance are you going to need to know yourself, other people are going to need to know, and that individual themselves are going to need to know to be able to successfully use that assistive technology to accomplish what it is that they want to do. And so, okay, so implementation should focus on the reason that you got the device. And so if you got that device to help somebody in the job, that's where you should be focusing your implementation efforts. And then in particular, in that area, you should be focusing on those functional areas that the individual was struggling with. And implementation is an ongoing process. Sometimes you have to scaffold up the use of the device. You're just happy if they do A and B with the device, but you really need them to do A, B, C, and D. And so once they master A and B, then you start adding other things that they can utilize that device for to achieve even more outcomes that are their desired outcomes. And then finally, it requires some planning when you do implementation. You may not be able to spend all the time necessary to help somebody implement a device. So you might have to bring in other people, and there are other people that should probably be brought in. So if it's in an employment setting, is there a manager that this person answers to? Can they be part of the implementation process? If it's somebody who's living independently, is there a personal care attendant that might be part of the implementation process? It should involve everybody who can contribute to helping that individual master the device and be able to use it for the purposes that it was intended to accomplish for them.
All right. I'm going to take it back over briefly just to talk about this really quickly. We have done a mod on funding before. So if you would like more details and a more in-depth version of this funding sources, we have that posted on our YouTube. So that's just charting the LifeCourse on YouTube, and there is a mod playlist, and you can go in there and watch the funding one. But what I will say about this is that this is just one of our stars with some funding sources for assistive technology. I have already sent out a link that has this in it, so you can look at it more. But it just gives some funding ideas for both assistive technology devices and assistive technology services in each of those 5 areas of the star. There is also another sheet that goes along with this, which I have also sent out, that just explains each of these points in more detail. So for example, there's like a couple foundations or a couple programs that are mentioned in the community-based or the eligibility-specific areas. And if you're not familiar with what those are, that sheet will give you some more information on those. Okay, so if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. But just as a recap, I will say that it is important to start with, figuring out the person, understanding what the person wants, what their needs are, and then using that to figure out what tasks they would like to accomplish, and then working through your feature matching, and making sure that you understand that it is a trial and error process. And just because you don't find the first device, the right device, the first time around, doesn't mean that there's not going to be one that's going to work for you. David, anything to add?
That was a nice recap there. Pretty much sized it all up. It's always keep in mind why it is that you're going down this road, and it's important that we build capacity within our agencies, within our organizations, and it's a great time to do it because there are a lot of ways we can use technology to improve life for individuals that we work with.
All right. So this is just our website, LifeCourse tools. Anything that we went over today as far as tools will be on there. And the recording and the slides from today will be sent out in a couple of days once I get those wrapped up, along with any of the other resources that I sent within the chat. And other than that, here is David and I's contact information if you have any questions from today, or anything else. But other than that, thank you all for joining, and we will see you next month.